Planning and implementing server upgrades and migrations. You're not going to buy all brand new servers to roll out Windows Server 2012. Well, you might, and if you do, I'd like your company name because I want to come work on all the shiny new servers. No, more likely you're going to be upgrading some servers and possibly migrating some. So we're going to talk about some of the steps involved, particularly from a planning perspective, around making that happen. So here's what we'll cover in this nugget. We'll talk about planning for role migration. And this is actually kind of a big deal. And one of the things I'm going to do is refer you to the Microsoft official documentation and guidance on migrating each individual specific type of role. Keeping in mind that Windows Server 2012 and its predecessors have got literally dozens of different roles. So I am also going to walk you through one of the role migration processes and kind of point out how you take that guidance and translate it into reality. So we'll look at a couple of the tools and kind of walk down the path a little bit. We'll talk about some of the concerns and tools involved in migrating servers across domains and forests. What actually happens to a server when you do that? Now, this isn't so much a upgrading to Windows Server 2012 thing as it is moving to perhaps a restructured domain or a new domain or dealing with corporate acquisitions and mergers and stuff like that. We're going to talk around some of the issues about designing a server consolidation strategy. Server virtualization is here, it's here to stay, and most organizations are looking to reduce the number of servers they've got, at least reduce the number of physical hosts they have if possible. So we'll talk about some of those design level concerns and some of the strategies and tactics you can take. And that kind of interleaves with planning for capacity and resource optimization as well. We'll talk about some of the capacity planning techniques that you should look at, some of the tools you can use to gather the data that you'll need to start those techniques, and so forth. So as promised, we're going to start with this list of official guidance from Microsoft. Now, a URL for you, technet.microsoft.com/en-us/library /JJ134039.aspx. Just memorize that URL. This has actually been updated for Windows Server 2012, and the good part of it is right down here. Specific migration advice for migrating specific roles, Active Directory Federation Services, your Health Registration Authority, part of Network Access Protection, Hyper-V, your IP configuration, Network Policy Server, also part of Network Access Protection actually, Print and Document Services, Remote Access, and Windows Server Update Services. This also provides you with links to specific server migration tools. And for other roles and resources, if you're using rights management services, things like that, there are some additional links down here. Each of these guidance documents is pretty darn detailed. I'm going to walk you through one of these. As I said, just to provide, well, a couple of things. I want you to see how these guides kind of map into reality. And I also want to point out how the guides do hint at, but don't always necessarily spell out in big, bold enough letters, some of the gotchas that you need to be prepared for as you migrate from these different things. So before we do that, we're going to talk about some general purpose migration concerns. Now, obviously, in any migration, your goal is to get a bunch of services or roles or features or whatever else from an old machine over to a new one. Now, how you do this in terms of affecting your user impact kind of depends on exactly what those services are. In some cases, you might need to do that migration over a weekend or during some other scheduled downtime so that you can kind of have all the services offline, migrate them, and then bring them back online for your users on that new machine. However you decide to do it, sometimes you're going to have coexistence, the old will be next to the new, whatever else. However you decide to do it, one of the big things to remember is how your users get to things. There's really two possible ways for your users to access, and that's via a computer name, and hopefully that's what they're using, or via an IP address. Now, at the end of the day, because a lot of these services are built into applications, or perhaps they're just built into users' habits, you want to try to keep things so that once things are migrated, users can continue to use the same name or the same IP address to access the same services, so that neither applications nor users' habits have to change. Now, because most of our machines are going to be joined to a domain, changing the name of a server is difficult. It means that if I start off with this one called new, and then I migrate all the services over, and then I want to rename it to old so that it will match what the old machine was, that actually gets a little bit tricky. Certainly not impossible, but you can mess it up. If your users, and this isn't likely, or applications, that's more likely. If your users or applications are using an IP address to access their services, well, that's easy. Once you take this one offline, you just change the IP address on the new server to match what the old one was using, and everything's fine. So IP addresses are easy to deal with. Names aren't difficult to deal with. If you're in a situation where you've got an old server, and we'll just pretend it's named old, and you've got a new server, which we'll pretend is named new, once the old one is offline, you can put a CNAME record into DNS for the old computer name pointing to the new computer name. And then DNS can obviously be used to resolve the new computer name's IP address as well. So you still can use some DNS trickery. And if you're in an environment that still needs it, you might also need to do that with WINS, depending on how people are resolving that name. So keep in mind that the real goal with migration for most organizations is to make things as transparent to the end user as possible. When that's the case, then you're going to have to be prepared to play a little trickery. I want to point out that one scenario we're specifically not covering in this nugget is the idea of taking this old machine and doing a P2V, physical to virtual. In other words, that's not really a migration. We still have the old machine. It's just not running on physical hardware, it's running on virtual hardware instead. But we still have the old machine, it still has its old name, it still uses its old IP address. Nothing has changed. It's still running on the old version of the operating system. So this migration concept is all about getting things on the new version of the operating system. Now, the other scenario that we're specifically not covering is upgrading, in which you install Windows 2012 on top of whatever operating system was there before, assuming that the operating system on the old machine is a new enough one that 2012 supports an in-place upgrade. We're not talking about upgrades at all. Those are actually covered in some of the MCSA exams. We're talking about the more difficult process of actually moving to a new server, could be virtual, could be physical, doesn't matter, and eventually decommissioning the old one. So with that in mind, let's start walking through a couple of specific scenarios, starting with tools. The exact migration tools that you need to install depends on exactly what role or features you are migrating. And if you start walking through those role migration guides, it'll tell you. There is one bundled set of Windows Server migration tools, and that migrates some roles. Other roles have their own tools, and there are some roles, quite frankly, that don't have any tools at all. A good example of that would be Active Directory. It's usually not necessary to migrate a domain controller. You would just install your new Server 2012 machine, make it a domain controller in your domain, let it replicate, and you're done. If for some reason that's going to replace an old domain controller, then you just decommission the old one, depromote it, take it offline, and you're finished. You're not actually moving anything from one place to another. So for some roles, migration doesn't make sense. But in any event, to get any of these, you're going to run the Add Roles and Features wizard. All of these things are, and I'm doing this on a server, but you could absolutely do this from a client computer, provided you have installed the Remote Server Administration Toolkit, or RSAT, for Windows 8. So we're going to skip past roles, because the stuff we want is actually a feature, and we're going to be looking for remote management tools. Here we go. It's partially installed already, which is why it's grayed out. Typically not looking for your feature management tools, although you may find the occasional one, like if you're migrating clusters and so forth, as being useful here. WINS, obviously, depending on the feature you're migrating, you might need some of these just to help keep things smoother. But I'm going to walk through the printer migration one, and that guide told me, let's pull it back up here so I can show it to you. Printer document services. This is going to tell me what tools I need. So to start with, it lists all the supported operating systems. That's fun. Supported role configurations, features, migrating, what's not supported. here we go. The services, access the migration tools. It tells me that these are actually part of the printer printer management console. So I just need to install that, print and document services tools. And scroll down a little bit further. There it is, Windows Server Migration Tools. And I'm just going to point these out so that you can see kind of what they're designed to do. So we'll next our way through this. This is just tools, so it shouldn't need a restart of any kind. You typically want to run the migration tools on the newest version of the operating system you have. These tools understand the older versions of Windows. So this tool that I'm installing on Windows Server 2012 is going to have no problem talking to any supported OS. And usually that's going to go back to Windows Server 2003, Windows Server 2008, and Windows Server 2008 R2. So that looks like it finished. And now we should be able to go over to Tools, and we'll start just by looking at Windows Server Migration Tools. Yeah, not what you expected, was it? Command line window. Yeah, that freaks everybody out. This is actually just a custom Windows PowerShell session, and I believe that the migration tools are actually a snap-in. So let's just see if that's the case. Yep, there it is, Microsoft Windows.ServerManager.Migration. So we can see what commands are part of this by limiting get command to just the commands in Windows Server Manager.Migration. So we've got a couple of things here. Server Manager, this is a SMIG, is server migration. So SMIG is a prefix that gets attached to each of these things. So it's going to get migration server features, export your data for your settings. You can import, you can receive, you can send, everything else. The easy one to probably start with is the get SMIG server feature. And so what this does is it lists all of the features that are on the local server that can be migrated, or the features on a remote migration store. So this is a pretty significant set of things here. Let's just run it and see what shows up. It does take it a little while to run sometimes, especially on this server, because I believe I have a whole bunch of different roles installed. So it's going to have to go through each of them and see what can be migrated. There we go. So this is finding two things, the WoW64 support and branch cache. Those are two things that are installed that could be migrated. Now, again, this is something that you're going to want to target against the machines that have the things you want to migrate from. So it's a matter of installing these tools. These Windows Server migration tools are available for older operating systems as well. And so the PowerShell commands actually do get installed on the machine that you are migrating from. And if you were to go back to that guide, that web page I gave you, it does provide links that tell you how to install this on every version of Windows that is supported by the migration package. So there are specific ones, and there is an entire process that gets walked through. When a role is migrated by these tools, so when you have a role that uses these tools as its migration, then the individual migration guide on that web page I gave you will give you the specific instructions for that role, and they're all slightly different. That's why I'm not going to walk through every single one of them. We'd be here for 10 days, maybe 12. But the guides are your goal there. You really, really want to make sure you understand what those do, because there's sometimes tons of prerequisites. Well, you're going to see as we walk through the printer one. Now, the printer one actually does not use this tool set. And I wanted to also show you an example of one that doesn't use that tool set. So let's take a look at the printer migration process. If you dive into this guide again, one of the big things that I wanted to point out, and one of the things that hopefully I can make clear here, is that there can sometimes be, as I said, significant prerequisites around migrating. For example, let's say you're migrating from a 32-bit operating system print server to Windows Server 2012, which only exists as 64-bit. You are going to have some significant work ahead of you, because your old server is going to be using 32-bit or x86 based print drivers, and your new one has to have x64 based print drivers. That has to be installed on the print server. The print server can also host the 32-bit print drivers for any 32-bit clients you have on your network so that they can use the print and play feature. But you have to make sure that you can actually get 64-bit printer drivers for every single printer that's going to be hosted on Windows Server 2012. So, and one of the things I said earlier about how sometimes these little gotchas aren't called out in giant headlines, I mean, this is something that I've seen so many folks trip up over. You know, they start the migration, they get everything migrated over, everything looks fine, suddenly nothing works. It's because this should have like giant circles and arrows and exclamation points all around it, because it's easy to overlook. It's easy for us to just not even think to check if it's a 32-bit system or a 64-bit system. So when you need to, go get your drivers, go to the add printer driver on your new machine, make sure the printer driver is installed, make sure the printer is all set up, everything else ready to go prior to actually doing the migration. So make absolutely sure. Now they do give you a little tip down here, and this is something that I like that they highlight. In some cases, we've got roles out there that have evolved over time. You know, in the case of a print server, it might be printers that used to exist but don't anymore. We've gotten rid of them. But the drivers are still installed on our print server. We don't want to migrate all that stuff. It can take a long time. It can make a lot of your migration slower. It can actually make the server slower because you have to have a lot of INI files and inf files that basically just get bloated out. So a migration is also a good time to clean up. Really take a hard inventory of what you've got and figure out what of that you actually need so that the new server can be a little prettier or nicer. And I got to tell you, that exact reason is one, I guess, driver for companies that don't actually migrate. In other words, instead of migrating using a tool to take some role from old to new, there's a lot of companies that will just set up a brand new server, reinstall and re-provision all of the roles and services from scratch. Now that still means going over here and getting a good inventory of what has to be over here, but by setting it up manually rather than migrating it, you get a chance to sort of review everything. It kind of forces you. Do I need all 12 of these printers? Because if I don't need all 12, I'm not going to waste my time. It's my time I'm spending, not the time of some tool. So if the business goal is to really evaluate and clean up the environment, sometimes a side-by-side installation as opposed to an automated migration can be a better way to go. It gives you a chance to reevaluate every single setting and checkbox and everything else. Now, the downside of this is it's time-consuming. It does take manual effort. And so if making it happen quickly is a business goal, then that's going to offset that. The other downside is it's risky. You might miss a setting over here, and this might not work well, and that might create problems in your environment. So it's one of the reasons when you walk through these migration guides, they're always going to tell you, back up the old server first. I actually recommend that you do a physical to virtual migration. Put the old server into a virtual machine where you can turn it off and leave it sit, and if you ever need to get to it, you can spin it up in a detached, non-networked virtual environment so that you can go in, look up what a setting might have been, and then replicate it onto your new machine. Now, as I mentioned, printing in particular has its own little migration bit. Where's my print manager thingy? Print management. Again, before you do this, you should already have installed your 64-bit drivers, right? Take care of your prerequisites before you begin a migration. Trying to relate this generally to migrating any role, they've all got prerequisites, and it's important that some of them be taken care of before you even begin the migration. So in this one, we launched the Migrate printers, and this is a pretty simple thing. You export your printer queues and drivers to a file on the source printer server. You carry that file over to the new one, and you run the wizard again to import. Now the trick with this, if your source server is x86, you're going to get all of the x86 drivers and print queues and everything else. You are then going to have to go manually switch those over to use a 64-bit driver. One of the tips that I can offer, and again, this is about cleaning up your environment, clean up the source server. If you know for a fact you've got 10 old printer drivers and 5 print queues that just aren't even used anymore and physically don't exist anymore, get rid of them, delete the queues, remove the ports, uninstall the print drivers before you do this export process. It'll speed up the export. And you know what I recommend? If you're going to do that, if you're going to uninstall, delete, and so forth, do it about a week before you actually do the migration. Because if you delete a printer and you leave it sit for a week and no one complains and calls your help desk, then you're right, it probably wasn't being used. Just make sure you have a little backup of it so that you can roll back to that in case you do delete it and the help desk immediately calls you and goes, hey, what's up? So kind of get the source into as good a shape as you can before you start. Export, carry it over to the new one, import, and then go back and fix. Now, this doesn't do everything. Again, every single role migration has tons of these caveats and stuff like that. For example, if you get back into this guide, this will tell you in here somewhere, there's additional stuff that might have to be manually migrated. So the migration tools that come in the box here do not always take care of the entire step. In this case, for example, if your server has LPR running on it, or if it uses IPP connections, or if it has the web services things, if it's in a cluster, then the cluster stuff doesn't migrate automatically. If it's got plug and play printers, like physically plugged into the server itself, obviously the migration wizard can't unplug it and carry the printer over to a new server. So you really have to read through these guides and find out what the migration process isn't going to take care of so that you can start making yourself a checklist of what it is going to take care of. So, from an exam standpoint, you don't be expected to be tested on every single little thing. What really helps is if you just understand how each of these broad services works. For example, if you have print servers in your environment, you should know that in order to make those accessible to Unix machines, you often have an LPR service. If it's accessible to web printing, then there's usually WSD. Clustering is something different. Plugging a printer directly into a machine, something different. If you get an awareness of what each of your roles actually involves from a technical perspective and how they work and how they're configured, that'll help you kind of prepare yourself for the migration, because you can then sit and look and say, gosh, I see where it's taking care of these drivers, but what about all these other services that I know are running? I haven't seen where those are taken care of yet. Being able to ask yourself that question is really kind of the key from getting the question right on the exam perspective. Now you might ask yourself, no, wait a minute. I'm supposed to know how every single feature on the entire operating system works, and I'm supposed to somehow dig into every single one of my servers and figure out what's there and how it's configured, and I'm going to miss something. Yep, you're right, but I got you covered. You see, Microsoft got you covered. They've got a variety of assessment and planning toolkits, or maps. Now, these have all been updated recently for Windows Server 2012. If you go to the home page for this, there are actually several different tools. There's one for desktop migration, one for general server migration, one for doing server consolidation with Hyper-V, which we're going to talk about in a second, VDI capacity planning. There's a bunch of these, Azure, SQL Server, yada, 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 yada. So I'm going to kind of just walk you through what this thing looks like. Now, the trick is I'm on a domain controller here, and the tool does not like to be installed on a domain controller. So we are going to flip over to another machine where I've already installed it. Now, this does rely on a SQL Server local DB, which it installs, but I've got to set this up first. So I'm just going to call the new database migration. Let it create a new database to work with. I literally just installed and ran this thing, so you haven't missed a thing. And then it just kind of walks you through the steps. First of all, collect an inventory. Go. Let's just inventory our Windows computers. I don't really have any Exchange I want to play with. I don't really want to talk about SQLs. Yeah, just do those. All right, discovery method. How is it going to find servers? Well, the easiest way in my environment is to get everything out of Active Directory. You could also scan IP address ranges, pull an inventory from SCCM if you're using that, start broadcasting using standard Windows networking protocols. You can even manually or import computer names from a file. So I'm going to need to give it some credentials. So company administrator, secret password. All computers, what the heck? I don't have that many computers, I don't think. Let me look in here real quick and just see. Yeah, let's just do all of them. Please provide account credentials to the platforms and technologies you've chosen. Okay, sure. Let's use... You can see it wants to query Windows management instrumentation down there, so I'm just going to give it my administrator account. It's a domain admin account, so it should have access to pretty much everything. And next. Oh, and because if you've got different credentials, like maybe you're going across a couple domains, or you've got some weird thing where not every computer has the same set of local administrators, you can configure multiple credentials like you saw, and it's going to try them in the order listed here. So since I've only got one, this is kind of a boring screen. So we hit finish, and then we casually wait. Fortunately, my lab does not have a ton of computers in it. You can see there it's discovered 2 so far and is attempting to inventory them. That inventory can take a little bit of time, so gonna go, yeah, you can see over on object count here, right out here in the corner. It's getting there. It's looking in the registry as well as WMI. I'm gonna go grab a cup of coffee. Let's come back and see what this does. Oh wait, no, it finished. No time for coffee. All right, well, fine. I guess I'll get coffee later. One of the reasons this thing wants to do this next step, collect performance data, is because this is part of consolidation as well as migration. We not only want to migrate stuff from one machine to another, but we might want to try and migrate things from many machines to a smaller number. And in order to do that, we've got to figure out how those existing machines are performing. What kind of load are they dealing with? So let's run that. Let's only look at our Windows-based machines. Let's choose computers from a list. I'm just going to grab everything that it found. It got these through Discovery and Active Directory, and you can see over here it's listing the workloads. It knows, for example, that that one's got a SQL Server installed on it and that it's not clustered. That credential should work for both of those computers. Do it in that order. Okay, now I'm totally going to go get a cup of coffee. Be right back. Okay, this has involved 2 cups of coffee, a bagel, and I was seriously considering a plate of eggs because the performance data collection takes a long time. You can see down here in the corner, it's still running. And actually here in the steps to complete, it's still running. And I can't even go on to these next steps, particularly the consolidation wizard and some of the migration stuff. But I did want to stop and show you, because you can close that progress dialog while it's going and just let it run in the background. I do want to show you some of the information that we've already got to deal with. For example, on the server side, it's going to show me how ready I am for Windows Server 2012. All of my systems meet the requirements. How many meet the R2 requirements? None of them. That's because they're all running Server 2012 already. Web application discovery. And we get down into virtualization. I don't have any virtual machines running, so there's no consolidation results. And those wouldn't be available until after the performance thing finishes anyway. Database, it did probably find SQL Server. Yep, so it's letting me know what I can do with that. All these other brands of databases. Software usage. Takes a sec to pull this up because this all comes out of WMI and goes into a database and has to be pulled back out. But it's letting me know how much SharePoint I've got, what kind of Windows servers I have, how many SQL servers, how many Exchange servers, how many links, how many devices and users are on the network, how many Windows servers are on the network, all this different stuff. So it's really helping me figure out exactly what I've got on my network. What is there? What am I going to have to deal with in terms of, oops, didn't mean to click that. In terms of, potential migration issues. I can look at summaries for individual machines. I can look at individual applications that are out there, what machines these are running on. So these are grouped by system name, right? So this first block, I can collapse it, makes it a little easier to see. First block is the first system. This is the second one. This is what's on it. These are the things I'm going to have to deal with. These are the things I need to be prepared to deal with on that machine. Performance metrics we don't have yet. We haven't processed through the log files. It's probably doing that as part of this discovery. Instance summary would apply to particular instances of software that I've got. I didn't see any. So the idea here is, again, just to help you not miss any tricks, not miss any details. So you're not thinking to yourself, okay, well, I think I'm ready to migrate the printers, so I just need to run that wizard, right? This would help you understand, no, you've got all these other services out there that need to go. And that way you can make sure you have a complete plan. This isn't going to do a thing for you in terms of doing the migration. This is strictly as the name implies, a planning toolkit. Now, I'm just going to go let this run in the background and finish itself off, probably take it the rest of the day, and hopefully not much longer. But let's proceed and talk about some other things. As I said earlier, that map, the migration assessment planning thing, actually comes in several different versions, and there is one specifically for server consolidation with Hyper-V. Now, I'm not going to run this one, but it takes the same basic pattern as the one we just looked at. It is agentless, so you don't have to deploy stuff all across your environment. It's designed to go figure out what you've got in your environment, how hard it's being used now, and what things might look like when you consolidated them onto virtual machines under Hyper-V. It'll also, and this is a clever little sales point, but you need to be aware of it, it'll also go find out your VMware infrastructure. So it'll find servers that are already virtualized running on vSphere that could be managed by Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager, leaving them on vSphere, or migrated, obviously, to Hyper-V, which Microsoft would, I'm sure, love for you to do. So when you start talking about consolidation, this is one way to do it. Now, I've seen a couple of folks use this tool, not for consolidating to virtual machines, but for consolidating to physical machines. Now, I know that's not really the thing anymore. If we're going to do it, it's probably going to be to virtuals. But in some environments, what you really want out of this is the workload discovery and assessment. And if it says, look, you can combine these things onto a host and you've limited your workload, let's say to SQL Server, if it says, look, you can take these 10 separate SQL servers and combine them together on one virtual host, well, then you can probably do much the same thing on a physical host that meets the same hardware specifications. So you can use this for a couple of different consolidation things, I suspect. But what it's going to do is, again, help you just figure out what's in your environment, how hard it's being used. That's the workload discovery. And then help you figure out how you can consolidate that and ultimately get fewer machines out of the deal. Now, one of the steps of workload discovery is figuring out your workload, your capacity. And that's another thing that is really, really tricky. Depending on the exact role you're talking about, figuring out capacities and figuring out trends and everything else can be really difficult. So I want to just point you to an example. This is on technet.microsoft.com. I've got this written down here, and I really should have bookmarked it, but I didn't. This is capacity planning for domain controllers.aspx. There's actually a bunch of these capacity planning documents floating around in TechNet, and each of them focuses on a particular major role. You'll find these for other server products too, like for System Center Config Manager and for SharePoint and so forth. But totally within the operating system, you'll find these capacity planning documents for a lot of different roles. And they walk you through figuring out, and this is the important bit, how do you figure out what your current capacity consumption is? What is the current workload of Active Directory? So looking at RAM, looking at network bandwidth, looking at data storage, looking at processor usage for Active Directory domain services, looking at the load placed by cross-trust client authentication. You know, if you've got users authenticating across domain boundaries and so forth. So they give you some worksheets here to sort of summarize all that information. And the idea is to figure out where you currently sit so that you can start looking at monitoring that capacity, figuring out how much CPU you really need versus what you currently have assigned but maybe aren't using, or what you currently have assigned and are exceeding the capacity of. Some considerations around different processor speeds, processor power management modes, things like how the OS interacts with storage and how that affects your overall performance. It really, really walks you through the fine-grained details. Again, this is something you have to become familiar with on a per-role basis because every single one of these roles loads the system in a slightly different way. Some of them are much more CPU bound. Some of them are much more sensitive to memory. Some are more sensitive to storage. Some have odd interrelationship between those main performance categories. So it's worth your time to review some of these things as you start thinking about capacity planning and how you're going to consolidate. Remember that capacity is an inherent part of a consolidation plan. You've got to figure out what you're currently spending in terms of resources so you can figure out if there's a way to consolidate that onto fewer machines. So just wanted to make sure you knew where some of those official resources were before we went any further. Our last topic for this nugget is migration. Specifically, well, I guess they've all been about migration, right? So specifically, migrating servers and workstations, but mainly servers, between domains or forests. Now, Microsoft does give you a tool to help with this. Download.microsoft.com, punch in ADMT, that's the Active Directory Migration Toolkit. The latest version as I'm filming this is 3.2. And if you look at the requirements, it will only run on Windows Server 2008 R2. Presumably, there will be a 3.3 or a 4.0 or some subsequent version that will run on Windows Server 2012, but it's not available yet. But that's okay. It's a pretty straightforward wizard, and what I really want to run through is the procedure it's taking, what it's actually doing in your environment. So let's say that you've got a server that sits in an existing domain, and you either want to migrate that to another domain in the same forest, or perhaps into an entirely different forest. Essentially, there's some basic steps. Step one, create a computer account in the new location. Step two is called security mapping. The idea here is that if this is moving over to this forest, then its computer account is changed and all of its local resources need to be re-ACLed or permissions reassigned so that the computer has permission to its own resources. The computer gets its permissions through its computer account. Because its computer account is new, it's got to be re-permissioned. There is another aspect of security mapping that can change too, particularly when you're moving across forests. If, let's say, this is a file server and you've got a bunch of permissions assigned to it, do those permissions need to get mapped over to accounts in the new forest? Or do the permissions remain, and it could be a new domain, or do the permissions remain for the old forest? In other words, are the people in the old forest still actually going to be accessing this stuff and you're just moving the server for management reasons? Or do you plan to get rid of the old forest and you need to re-permission all those resources to map to new accounts in the new domain or forest? So that's all part of the security mapping process. Now, in a lot of cases, that will involve something called SID history. And basically what that means is as you add the permissions for the accounts in the new location, you leave them with the permissions from the old place. And the SID history actually doesn't take place on the file, it takes place on the account in Active Directory. So that sort of presumes that you've migrated users. So when a user migrates from here to here, they get a new SID in the new location, but their old SID stays tied to the account in the new location. So essentially they've got two. That way they can continue to access resources that were ACLed with the old SID while those resources are being re-permissioned to have the new SID instead. Once you've re-permissioned all your resources and there are no longer any references to the old SID, you can go through and remove the SID history as a separate sort of post-migration task. And those are sort of the broad brush strokes of a migration. Now, the Active Directory Migration Toolkit is a pretty good tool for moving things around place to place and helping to automate that process, making sure it all happens. It even can let you do, I guess you would call it a pilot or a trial run. And it can pretend to run through the whole process and let you know if it thinks it's going to run into any errors. So you can kind of address those before you do the real thing. Now, as I said, as the time I'm filming this, there is no ADMT to run on Server 2012, and that is a case where you generally want the migration tool running on the newest version of the OS. So we're just a little bit ahead of the curve right now. But that's the general process that the migration would involve, no matter what version of the ADMT you're using. Now, you know I wouldn't leave you hanging. As you can see, my performance data finally got collected. So we should be able to flip through a few of these now and see some of the performance information. Little progress bar down here tells me it's doing something behind the scenes. There we go. So it's telling me my average utilization. So I've got a lot of free room in terms of resources on these machines. And so back on the data collection screen, the next thing I can run, which will be useful for us, is the server consolidation wizard. Now, every time I run this, it does take a few seconds to get going. Oh, not too bad. You will notice that this has not been updated to include Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. And I believe that is because they have, because they have this separate Hyper-V map toolkit that sits all by itself. And like I explained earlier, this does a lot of the same things, collects a lot of the same data. I'm going to actually use this one. It might even plug into the same database and be able to use the data you've already collected. But that's why this tool has not been updated to include Server 2012, I'm guessing. But we can still just plug this in. I'll show you what it does. You got to tell it what kind of hardware you're going to run your virtual machines on. And that's what this consolidation is. We're moving to virtual machines, we're consolidating, we're getting rid of hardware. What kind of hardware are we going to run on? You can pick any of these models that they've come up with. Utilization settings. In my organization, we like to keep processors at no more than 80% and memory at 90. Leaves us a little bit of extra room just for fluff. I've never met a network that actually achieves 100% network utilization, so let's put that on 80. And now what I'd like to do is see what it would take to consolidate all of my servers onto such a host. So it's going to summarize all this stuff. You can see the actual processor configuration, or the hardware configuration I selected. That was visible with a view button on that hardware configuration screen as well. So how many processors it has, how many cores, yada, yada, yada. 12 cores, 2 sockets, drool. Run finish. And then we get to sit. This doesn't take very long because all the data is actually already in the SQL Server database. So that's done now. And then we can move over to server virtualization and look at our consolidation results. So it says it found 2 devices. It got everything from them. They've both been requested for consolidation. They have been placed successfully into a host. And it says that we would require 8 such hosts and 1 infrastructure. And it makes a lot of assumptions about utilization and everything else that you can adjust. But one of the reasons it's doing that is because I jacked those utilization numbers down so much. So it's telling me that on host 1, I can and this is the only one that's actually being utilized, by the way. Here's a little trick about this, and I guess it's kind of a gotcha. It's telling me it wants 8 hosts, but it is only actually using 1. So there is sort of some built-in under-the-hood number that isn't being explained very well by the output. But anyway, what it's telling me is that on that host, I can expect 6% memory utilization, about 3 gigs of RAM utilization, about 17 IOPS, that's input-output operations per second, about 30 gigs of disk utilization, and almost no network throughput. And that's based on the performance that was collected from these actual physical servers. So what this is designed to do is look at servers, either physical or virtual, look at what they're doing right now, and figure out how many of those could be virtualized and smooshed onto a single host having a given hardware configuration. So pure consolidation play. It's a pretty neat little tool. Definitely got some use to it. If you haven't played with it, it's worth your time to download it and give it a whirl. So we've talked about planning for role migration. I showed you where you can find some of the official Microsoft guidance for migrating specific roles, and each of them, because they're so different, really has its own specific process that you should become familiar with. I did walk you through one of those so that you can kind of see how the guidance actually maps into the tools and what some of those migration concerns are. And I think the big lesson to take away from there is really think about every single little element. One of the things we talked about, the 32-bit printer driver versus 64-bit printer driver, huge gotcha if you don't think about that. Talked also about the steps involved in migrating servers across domains and forces, what's involved, what tools are available in the box to help you out. And we also talked about some of the design level strategies for server consolidation, which also interleaved into planning for capacity and resource optimization. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.